War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And today our special guests are Chrissy Gregg, Assistant Director of Distance Learning.
Hey, Seth.
Jason Dawsey, Research Historian here at the museum.
Thanks for having me.
And Amber Mitchell, Assistant Director of Public Engagement here at the museum.
Hey, everybody.
Today we will be discussing the 2015 Danish film entitled April 9th. The film centers on the actions of a Danish bicycle reconnaissance unit stationed on the German-Danish border just before and during the German invasion in 1940. We follow the unit as they prepare for a possible invasion and watch as they meet the Germans and do their utmost to stop the inevitable wave of invaders. April 9th stars Pilu Asbæk as Second Lieutenant Sand, Lars Mikkelsen as Lieutenant Colonel Hintz, Gustav Giese as Anderson, Elliot Hove as Lassen, and many more. The film was directed by Ron Ezra, produced by Ezra and Thomas Rador, and written by Tobias Lindholm. The film received mixed but generally favorable reviews when released. So as we always do, and Amber, if you don't mind, I'll start with you because you're sitting next to me. In your opinion, how accurate is April 9th?
I thought that it was really interesting to see the youth of these actors that were really kind of embodying how young the soldiers were during this battle and how sort of green behind the ears that they were. So I would say it was probably accurate in that aspect. But it was a really interesting film as somebody who was definitely unfamiliar with this topic beforehand.
What about you, Jay?
I think it's quite accurate in that it shows like less than a day of engagement between Denmark and Germany. It's just an area, of the war that's usually completely forgotten unless you happen to be in Denmark. And in that sense, it shows these guys along the border between Denmark and Germany, and they're asked to do something that's absolutely hopeless, which is hold them off as long as you can until reinforcements arrive. And you see the futility of that and the fact that they hold out a matter of hours. But in that, it really does show you what they were up against and gives you a sense about what it's like to face a military situation where you have no chance.
What about you, Chrissy?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel similarly to Amber. I chose this episode because I thought it'd be something interesting to learn about, and some of it was new to me for sure. But I think, if anything, that the filmmakers were trying to be accurate. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more later, that, a lot of the shots of the equipment, the machinery of their uniforms, felt like they were trying to capture all the little details. And with that, I think their goal was to be accurate in addition to compelling. So I'll say that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the movie was very accurate. Admittedly, Denmark, or the invasion thereof, is not one of my strong suits because it lasted for only 6 hours, the entire conflict. But it was, what I did read up on about it, obviously, before we did this and before I watched the movie. And it seemed pretty darn accurate. There was a lot of stuff in there that was good. It looked very good. It sounded really good. There wasn't a whole lot of heavy fighting, and that was portrayed pretty well in this film. So I think the accuracy and that level was very good. When you think of the invasion of the West, 1940, you think of Belgium and you think of France. Those are the two countries, and maybe Norway as well. Well, of course, Norway came right after, actually on the same day as the invasion of Denmark. But you don't ever think of Denmark. You think of Holland too, but you don't ever think of Denmark. And probably because it did only last 6 hours. But there were some harbingers of a German invasion. Was Denmark forewarned about a German invasion before it actually occurred? What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, they definitely are getting warnings from their own military about activity along the border, and that's been happening for a number of days. And that's early in the film you get that, the kind of some of the really tense moments early on where you get these officers who were kind of pouring around a table and they're talking to people on the border and they're saying, what are we supposed to do? If the Germans come across, what's the plan for us to fight? We've been hearing things now for days we've been seeing things about troop movements and the like, about columns beginning to assemble, and we're just sitting here. And so they had some warning about that, but the Danish government was convinced that it could still, I think, negotiate its way out of any kind of confrontation with Germany. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this later too, but there was a non-aggression pact it had signed, in fact, less than a year earlier with Hitler. And so they wanted to ensure they didn't do anything to give the Germans an excuse, and it turned out they didn't have to give them an excuse.
Right. I think there was some diplomatic warning, too, beforehand. Then I cannot naturally think of the guy's name right now. But the Germans essentially said, yeah, we're probably coming in the next few days. And I think the movie does, as you said, a really good job of showing that or letting you hear that, if you will, because you hear the tanks rumbling on the other side of the border. The officers are discussing about, is this another drill, or are we preparing for something that may happen? And I think they did a really good job of that. Did the warning have any effect on their plans for defense or surrender at all, do you think? Anybody?
Well, I mean, they brought back their privates or their low-level soldiers from vacation, right?
Called people off leave.
So they were prepared for, or preparing for, something to go down. I don't know if they were quite sure that it was going to be as a full-on invasion like what happened, but they were preparing for something. I think what was most interesting to me was to see just how relaxed some of the soldiers were about this. Like in the very beginning when they were doing their drills, and that first group, or that last group, of 3 came rolling up with their suitcases, and like they just seemed really lackadaisical about the whole situation. Like, oh yeah, it might happen, it might not happen, but who really cares, because we're all just kind of hanging out anyway. And then it actually does happen, and they're just so overwhelmed, like we couldn't expect that this could happen, but y'all had warning beforehand if you were really paying attention and really concerned about it.
I like the way that the film, like you said, the three infantry, the 3 grunts that are making their way up to the drill ground. They have no clue. They're talking amongst themselves. They're like, oh, is this another damn drill? This is just a waste of time. Blah blah blah. And everybody that was there, they were all either low-ranking NCOs, privates. There was one officer there, a lieutenant. And then, of course, our hero arrives, second lieutenant arrives, but none of them really knew. I mean, the lieutenant had an idea, but and then all of a sudden, boom, the drill is canceled. Everybody get back to barracks. Mm-hmm. And I think the film did a really good job of showing that when they got back to their barracks, even without being told, the young guys knew something's coming.
Yeah.
And they
those
were,
40 rounds they got, right? And they're like, oh, this is not enough.
This is not enough. And nobody could sleep. Nobody could sleep. Everybody's tense. They're writing letters home. They're, picking at each other, and the intensity is in the air. And I think the film did a really, really good job at doing that. So this is a bicycle reconnaissance group, which is not something that you see portrayed in war movies very, very often. Were bikes commonly used in the Danish military, or elsewhere for that matter, during World War II? So
for the D-Day course, continuing education course, we did a segment on one of the bikes in our collection. I think we have 4, at least there's 4 hanging in the vault. And we did one on the folding bikes that British and Canadian paratroopers brought, and then also the seaborne troops brought, models of bikes too. So even in something that we are also familiar with, D-Day, I don't think always people are thinking about, bicycles. So it's kind of neat. When I started to explore, I was like, oh, wait, bikes are actually, I think, more prevalent in this war. If we just need to think about it a little bit more. So doing a little bit of research that, there were bike groups in Italy and Germany. Obviously, this is accurate to the Danish experience. There's a Swiss bicycle group, and I actually think the Swiss military bicycle group just disbanded like a decade ago or a little bit longer, So I think especially in small countries that are, mountainous, that sometimes bikes are a lot potentially easier to get around in certain terrain than even motorized vehicles are. So,
and they're silent for the most part. You don't have a internal combustion engine making a bunch of racket. Bicycles are quiet, and this is a recon group, so they're going to go out there and gather intelligence or maybe do a hit and run and get out of there. And the bikes are perfect for that kind of thing.
Right, but at the same time, you're using manpower to power the bike.
Right.
And so, like, if you're like that one poor guy who was at the back of the group, was just a little bit chunkier, who was just like, oh, like he's really dragging to get that bike, going. So, and they hadn't even really gotten into any skirmishes yet.
But they weren't that uncommon, though. I mean, like you said, Chrissy, there were seemingly a lot more European nations used them than
True.
We didn't. We didn't.
Right.
The United States Army didn't, and neither did the Marine Corps. But the main, like the most successful users of the bicycle reconnaissance troops or bicycle troops were the Japanese. Actually, the Japanese, I found this figure yesterday, which I thought was pretty cool, really. In the 1937 invasion of China, some 50,000 Japanese were equipped with bicycles.
Jeez.
50,000 bikes. That's a lot of bicycles. Mm-hmm. And when they went into Malaya, they knew that the Malayan populace got around on bicycles a lot, so they didn't even bring their own bicycles. They just took them. They just took them from the local citizenry. And the most successful use of them was the capture of Singapore. So during the capture of Singapore, the Japanese used bicycles, and that allowed them to circle back around the British and cut them off. And the British wondered why they got there so fast, and it was because they were on wheels. So what do you guys think of the depiction of the Danish soldiers? I have my own opinions, but I want to hear what you guys think first. Chrissy, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to reiterate what Amber said in her first comment, that, I really appreciated seeing how young they really were, because I feel like, none of these men have probably seen combat before. Even the upper, ranks, this is all new to them. And I think certain points of the movie, you see all of them kind of panic a bit when they realize that it's all is lost, or what are they doing here? There's a scene where they're looking up at the German aircraft above them, and Pilu Asbeck, I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, but Second Lieutenant Sand, he is looking up at the sky in this utter despair, and so I think they do a really great job showing kind of the overwhelming nature of what that experience was, probably for the common soldier.
Yeah, I like how the film shows the realization setting in about how terrible their situation is, and you really kind of see that develop in the film. You don't have to wait very long, for some combat, and that by the time you see it, you already kind of realize, okay, these guys, how could any of them have seen combat before? Denmark had not been in World War I, so even like their fathers, don't have that kind of connection in the way that so much of Europe, if you, in 1939, 1940, 41, most of Europe had been in World War I. And so if you're a soldier on any of those nations, you probably had a father, an uncle, or someone who had seen combat, knew of it.
Or your commanding officer.
Or commanding officer had, exactly. But in the Danish case, that's not the case. You don't really have a war experience to go back to until the 1860s. And so they, of course, had fought Prussia and Austria in that decade, but that's 75 years ago. So for them, I mean, they're individually green. I think that's shown extremely well, but the country as a whole had not had that kind of combat. And here you are facing the Germans, and they're right across the border. At least in Norway, they've got to fly in, they've got to send the Navy in. But in the case of Denmark, the border is right there. They just have to roll across it.
Which they did.
And I think you see that with the civilians, too. Like, they're not expecting, I know we'll get into that later, but there's that same sort of, shock about it when you see the civilians just, milling about in the street. It's like, go back in your house, people. Like, what are you doing?
Well, yeah,
and
they're like, what's going on? What's happening out here?
So,
and you're like, get in the
masses.
house, Margaret.
Right. So you see that with, whether it's the soldiers or the civilians, they're not ready for what's about to hit them.
Yeah. I think the depiction of the Danish soldiers, like everybody said here at the table, was very accurate. Just like you said, Jason, that none of these people had seen combat before. I think one of the soldiers' father was a German, and you could maybe guess, well, maybe his dad might have told him about, who knows. But I mean, that's just pie in the sky thinking. But no one had seen any combat, so I think in that regard, they were shown very well. And I mean, it was a very small army. But it was a well-trained, well-disciplined army, and they showed, historically, And they showed that in the film, I think, very, very well. I mean, these guys snapped to. They moved, and they moved as a unit. The actors were clearly well trained for this role because they moved like soldiers, and they deployed like soldiers. So they looked very, very good. But there wasn't anybody in Denmark who'd seen any kind of combat, unless they were an advisor with somebody else or something like that. And I have some figures here that I think are pretty amazing. In the Danish Defense Act of 1937, set up a peacetime establishment of two divisions, an independent anti-aircraft and an engineer regiment, an Army Air Force, the Bornholm Garrison, Transport Battalion, and a general headquarters. That is it. That is it. In peacetime, the regiments and battalions were no more than a small administrative staff responsible for the training of the annual intake of 6,599 conscripts who were to be allocated as follows: 4,340 to the infantry. That is it. Their entire infantry was not even the size of a depleted German infantry, or any infantry division for that matter. On April 8th, 1940, there were 6,600 conscripts with 11 months training service with the colors, as well as a further 2,000 non-combatants. During the German invasion, part of this force was on leave, while a further 7% were unfit for duty. There's no way on earth these guys could have stopped the Wehrmacht. And the Germans knew that, because when if you look at the invasion force, they sent over 3 divisions, and even then, they weren't exactly the front line divisions that rolled into France and Belgium and Poland, the year before. And the Germans knew that they were not going to put up a whole heck of a lot of a fight. And frankly, they didn't, because they didn't have a hell of a lot of time. But we talked about the equipment. This is something, when you watch World War II movies, you see Germans all the time, so you're kind of familiar with their equipment. Even if you're not familiar with their equipment, you know what it looks like. But the Danish stuff, this is all new, and at least to me, And I think it was done very, very well. What's your opinion?
They borrowed some stuff from a museum, I know. So I think they were at least trying to be accurate as they possibly could. As I said, kind of in the beginning, that because they were so deliberate in how they filmed those details, I would imagine the goal is, to set a tone, but also to get it right, because they know they would have probably been criticized to spend that amount of time on those things, and if they didn't get it right. So my assumption, not being an expert on Danish equipment or military paraphernalia, is that it's probably pretty stinking accurate.
I think it was. I agree with you. There were a couple of things in there that were flubs, like they had a German with an MG-42, and of course this is 1940, so there were no MG-42s in 1940. And there was another scene in there where it was German equipment, which is odd because there's a heck of a lot more German equipment available even today than Danish equipment. There were a few things in there that were of German origin that were, aside from the 42, that were not what they should have been. But I was looking at some of the Danish equipment, the leather gear. You could see the cracks in it. So I'm assuming that was original stuff, which is pretty impressive too. That they actually went out there, they got that stuff, and they put it out there and put it on.
And I think it was great to see what a kind of a lightly equipped force, and knows it's lightly equipped. That you're up against overwhelming odds. How they kind of try to figure it out on the ground. I think that first combat scene where they run into that German column, and they got a light machine gun, really is what they have, and they've got rifles, but you just don't have a lot. And yet they make the Germans fight there, and at least kind of put them on notice that they may run into, resistance. They probably had run into some of those motorcycle troops a little earlier in the film. We kind of get that. They had been there, right? And then they move north. But, they do put them on notice. And so I think that the film, obviously I think there is an attention to historical detail, and they really show you, this is what they could do, because you don't really have a lot to wonder about. And you see, look, they've got a couple of light guns you see in the scenes in the town. Yeah,
they have later. A Madsen, yeah.
Right, they have there, but they don't have a great deal. And then they know they don't, and yet there are a number of moments where, just as it was historically accurate, they fought. They did.
I have to give kudos to the actors who were part of the light machine gun crew. Those guys were awesome. You could tell that they were trained and they had practiced with that weapon a lot. You know, the way the operator was firing the weapon, you know, it was very evident that that the actor had been trained on it. The way they reloaded the weapon, you know, in a blinding flash, they're changing out that magazine. And again, you could tell that that these guys put a lot of work into this before they ever even filmed this movie. And that looked really good. Mm-hmm. It looked really good. It was very well done.
The weapons, to me, just kind of seemed really dated, like as compared to what the Germans
very
had.
Antiquated, yeah.
You know, it almost, to me, I just kept thinking of, this is like David and Goliath over here. Like you've got a slingshot and some pebbles, and they've got literally everything under the sun. And it just felt like so unfair in some ways, you know, as a group that wasn't necessarily fully expecting for you to be coming over the border, but you kind of had an idea, but it seemed like they felt like really unprepared in more ways than one, not just in terms of getting their armies ready and everybody being on the same page, but also just having the best weaponry to be able to defend yourself, to really give them a run for their money, you know.
Well, the rifle that they were using is based off of, well, it's a descendant of a rifle that the American military used in the Spanish-American War, called the Krag Jorgensen, and it's loaded. If you open up the left-hand side of the receiver, you literally feed one round at a time in here and close a little door and rack the bolt, and there you go. You got 5 shots. There's no magazine-fed weapon. Like even the Germans, the 98K, you know, it's a bolt-action rifle, but you feed 5 rounds through a stripper clip. You can load that weapon in the blink of an eye. And this thing, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I mean, even the riflemen were. Yeah, they were poorly equipped because they were not it was not a modern military, and they're facing the most modern military, most powerful military at that time in the world. And I mean, the Germans could have sent, 60 guys over there, and they'd have been able to run over them, frankly.
I will say, though, simultaneously, with all that in mind, they portray it so nobly, though. Like, they don't, you feel like it's David and Goliath for sure, but they could have really just like, in some ways looked at the like bicycle platoon in a critical way, or but you felt invested in their story. You felt I don't know. I felt something seeing all of that antiquated stuff that wasn't at the level of what the German military was bringing over. There was something in that portrayal, though, that was very deeply humanizing. So,
and that's the second lieutenant. He's so important in conveying that. On the one hand, he is all too well aware of the limitations that his unit, the platoon, he's really overseeing, what they can actually do. So he wants to make sure his men live, to protect them, and yet he wants to also fight. He wants to fight. And so he's really torn between that, and you see that kind of play out throughout the film as the urge to fight the Germans, to protect the country as much as they can, or at least slow them down. And then on the other hand, just the necessity of keeping his men alive given the odds they're facing.
I thought it was, I don't know if anybody picked up on this, I'm sure you did. At least through the first half of the movie, he didn't refer to anybody by a name. Mm-hmm. They were all by numbers, 212, 225, 235, all that jazz. But after they get after they get out of the town, and they reach the third spot where there is combat, where it ultimately ends, he's calling them by their names. He's calling every one of them by their names because you almost kind of assume in the beginning, does he not know their names? Does he not know, or is that standard? Is that SOP? Are they supposed to call these people by their numbers because that's all they are? They're numbers. They're not people. I don't know. And then at the end, he knows everybody's name, and he's calling every single one of them by their name. So to your point, Jason, it shows that all he did want to do is get those people out alive. And he tells the old lady in the house, I'll do my utmost to, I forget exactly what I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I'll do my utmost to protect them, or something along those lines. Because she says, why don't you just,
Mm-hmm. What's the point of all
Why don't
this?
you just hide? Why don't you just hide them?
Yeah. But speaking of civilians, how accurate is the depiction of civilians and their feelings towards Germany in this film?
So I kind of dug into this because I thought those scenes with civilians for me were some of the most compelling. That woman in the farmhouse, and then the civilians just like milling about until the Germans showed up in that town. So I found a book, and I did a little research about like Danish reactions to the German occupation. So I was looking in that area of Schleswig. Again, apologies about the pronunciation, North Schleswig. There was a German minority there, roughly 30,000 Germans that lived in that area. So I think, there was probably more support for Germany in that area than obviously other areas of Denmark. But as we know, there was potentially some support. There was a German Nazi party all the way to, cooperation. I think we can get to that later as once the country's occupied, but how that cooperation eventually turns into resistance. And so I think it's probably a sliding scale and a variety of opinions, but I could see there that the woman in that farmhouse really conveyed maybe she was native German. So
well, she said 20 years ago this was Germany.
Right, and that's true too. It's something else, we can bring up that area was not always Denmark. So, but even at the time when it was Denmark, there was about 30,000 Germans that lived there.
Right. And see, in that element of that space, that border space being so transient in terms of people crossing the borders back and forth, that being a former German area, now Danish, I wonder it had me thinking on if the civilian experience and relationship with Germany was different for those who were far north, like much farther north in Denmark, that didn't have maybe a daily interaction with Germans on the border, versus those who were living there. And it was really interesting to see at the very end of the film, the Danish kids, the kids from Denmark with wearing the German helmets and, waving the flag and all of that stuff. And you're like, y'all realize you're cheering for the wrong side there. You really have just been invaded and your country has surrendered. So is that a time to celebrate? Do you all really understand, what the real situation really means right now, or are you just being kids? Being kids.
I think they were just being kids. But I mean, in 1940, especially at this early stage in the war, I don't think anybody understood what German occupation meant.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't.
Yeah.
Except for Jews who were living in Germany. I mean, that's it. I mean, this is 1940. This is April of 1940. We haven't invaded France yet. The Germans haven't invaded France yet. So, I mean, that occurs in the summer. And so, no, I don't think anybody understands what living under German rule is like. And Denmark, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but Denmark, had a kind of a special set of circumstances for them during their occupation. But, I found it kind of interesting that, the lady in the house, she was kind of unique because I can understand it kind of reminds me of the Alsace region, in France and Germany and in parts of Belgium too, during the Battle of the Bulge, and even before in 1940, there were sections of the Ardennes that was Germany, before World War II. And, they were kind of like, oh, welcome back, boys. Thanks for coming. And they did it in 40, and then they did it again in 44. So, I mean, it was not just located here that this kind of thing happened. But I found it interesting that, as they kept pulling back further north, our heroes here in the film, even in the final town, the people unfurled the Hakenkreuz and hung it out of a window, and the ladies and the boys were, hanging out with the German soldiers in the town, and everybody's getting along just fine. And it was like, again, it's like, what took y'all so long? I kind of got that feeling.
You see that with the character, and I'm forgetting his name, with glasses. He has a German father and a Danish mother, and he's from that area. And the second lieutenant, in fact, asked him about it. You know this area, and it's a contested area that it ended up becoming part of Germany because of the war with Denmark in the 1860s, and then after World War I, they have the plebiscite there after the peace agreement, and that area then goes to Denmark. So it had been there for back 20 years or so. So it's an area where there are some divided loyalties. And no doubt that there were Germans in that area that were excited to see them roll across. When they weren't necessarily going to fight and support them coming across, but they were eager to see it.
Yeah, there wasn't going to be a coup.
They certainly weren't going to oppose it, and so those Danish forces are in an area where they know everybody's not going to rally around them. I think Chrissy gave the number like 30,000.
Yeah, that's a lot probably for that area.
It is because it's a rural agricultural area. You kind of get that in the film. Those shots them out this miles of countryside that's there. It's a rural agriculture area. There's scattered towns and the like there, but they're in a place where they can't just simply count on having the population backing them all the way.
Well, let's jump ahead a little bit, and now that you brought it up, let's talk about that. Denmark's unique position before and during the war. Like you said, Jason, they were neutral in the First War. They had the plebiscites, a 10-year non-aggression pact with Germany. They're knocked out, within 6 hours. And then there was a resistance movement in 44. Well, kind of started in 43, but 44 is when it really went full swing. Let me hear what you got to say about that. Let's hear.
It's so different. I think it's hard to compare it to most of the areas that are under German occupation. One is because there's a shared border. I mean, the Germans are right there, and yet for probably 3 years, they have a kind of, as far as you can ever say this about the Nazi regime, it's kind of a velvet glove. They allow Denmark to keep its legal system and its police forces. The king, Christian X, he stays in the country. You think about Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, where monarchs get out. They go to the UK, but Christian X stays. And so there's a kind of, the Danish government is basically allowed a lot of autonomy that's there. And the Jewish population, and Chrissy's already alluded to it, that the Jewish population there in Denmark is basically left alone for 3 years. I mean, people still go to synagogue. They never wear the Star of David. They don't really face discriminatory laws in the way that they did in a lot of other countries that are either collaborating or certainly ones under German occupation. And so it's a very different set of circumstances. So people will argue to this day about the decision to surrender so quickly on April the 9th, but the Danish government was convinced it could work out a deal that would be beneficial to Denmark in this new Nazi order, and for a while it was really beneficial. I mean, for a lot of Danish citizens, at least until 1943, it would be hard to tell there was much of a war going on for them. I mean, life wasn't terribly unchanged from the way it had been during the war. As you just said in 1943, that will change. But until then, yeah, it's really different.
And in 43, I mean, that's when because they even let the Danish military still exist.
Right, remember in the film, like, go back to your barracks.
Go back to your barracks.
And he was like, what?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a very real, probably crazy
they
thing.
let them, obviously, I think their force was like 3,500 after, not that it was huge before, but the Germans, allowed them to have a military of either 3,300 or 3,500 people. And they allowed them to do pretty much whatever they wanted to do within reason. And you don't see, like you said, Jason, you don't see that anywhere else in the greater Großes Deutsches Reich. You don't see that anywhere. Nowhere are they basically left to their own devices, really, for 3 years. And then in 43, the Germans decided to end the collaboration, if you will, and then occupy Denmark, like fully occupy it like they did everywhere else. And then that's when the relations started to go south.
It leaves Denmark in such this, strange spot of World War II memory because I saw this article that Denmark was only, I'm sorry, my brain is still on D-Day, I guess, but Denmark was only invited to D-Day celebrations in 2014, so 5 years ago on the 70th. But before, they were not invited as a nation because they weren't seen as, an allied, lending to the Allied cause, even though there were 800 Danish sailors that participated in D-Day. So it's such a strange, it's in such a unique spot during World War II. It's kind of hard to, kind of pinpoint where Denmark really stands. And we can also talk about the Danish resistance. There were thousands of people that lent a hand in one way or the other. But they collaborated with the Nazis. So
They totally did. And I was going to bring that up.
What does that all mean? You know, I just that was kind of the biggest takeaway for this film for me.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to bring that up. And there was collaboration. There were, the Germans heavily recruited for their military in Denmark. And over 6,000 Danes volunteered for the Waffen-SS. And, a lot more volunteered for the German army and the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, but say over 6,000 guys volunteered for the Waffen-SS and went to fight with them. Freikorps Denmark is what it was called. Went to fight with the Totenkopf of all German units, the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and they fought in the Demyansk Pocket on the Eastern Front, and they got obliterated. It's like 78% casualties. I mean, that's massive. That's a massive amount of casualties. They came home, they reformed, and they went back out again. So, I mean, they were actually disbanded, and they were they were filed into the Nordland, SS Nordland Division, which included Dutch, Danes, Norwegians, and other Scandinavian peoples in this one particular Waffen-SS division. But, I mean, these guys, they were not sitting idly by, shall we say. So, I mean, I can almost kind of understand why they weren't necessarily invited to D-Day celebrations when you have a bunch of people, thousands of them literally, volunteering for the Waffen-SS of all, organizations, of all military branches. So, it kind of makes sense. I mean, they weren't totally innocent.
No.
And you put your finger on it. I mean, Nazi racial ideology obviously played such a role in occupation policy. And given the fact that the Danes, aside from sharing the border, they fulfilled the stereotypes that so many Nazi racial ideologues will point to, blonde hair and blue eyes, that gave them a kind of favorable view from the start with Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and company. And that's not the only factor in terms of the character of the occupation, but it's a very important one that the Nazis saw them as they're good Aryans. They're really good Aryans, and the history of the Vikings fascinated so many Nazi leaders, and so they saw Denmark as a place that was really, part of the Aryan orbit of Europe, and that did aid Denmark a great deal for 3 years. And it's interesting, Chrissy bringing up the D-Day celebrations, because then the issue of Holocaust memory, and we shouldn't separate, obviously, World War II memory from Holocaust memory. Those are completely intertwined, but in many ways you have to kind of keep them distinguished. In the history of Holocaust memory, of course, Denmark is remembered as one of the great cases of rescue and of resistance.
So I was curious about that too. So I was looking up on Yad Vashem about how many are righteous among the nations are there from Denmark, and the Danish government said we want Danish resistance in general to be counted as one. So actually the number, I don't want to say it's low, but they are counted as one group, but it was thousands of people, and that's how it's remembered. They have a remembrance tree planted there and stuff like that. So that is the memory. There's this another, false thing that the Holocaust Museum in D.C. had to put out that it's did King Christian X wear a Star of David? And that's not true. But that myth exists because of, what you just said, Jason.
Yeah, Danish Jews did not have to wear the Star of David, much less the king. But in 1943, you see that there's resistance fighters and sympathizers who begin to organize the Jewish population. We're talking 7,000-8,000 people, to get them out when they learn. They get information. There's a German diplomat who kind of tips them off that the Gestapo, SS are planning to round up Danish Jews, and so they organize this effort. And eventually, they get support all the way to the top. They get police who refuse to cooperate. There's all kinds of little sanctuaries given, and so it's interesting. I think that what Seth was bringing up about the number of young men who volunteer for the Waffen-SS, that's there, and who fight with the German army and are just fine with the Germans being there because the occupation is so light. And you also get a real resistance effort that saves probably 90% of the Jewish population. It's both. And so it makes it such a strange, complicated history, I think, for anybody to deal with. I mean, there's plenty of resistance movements in Europe, but there's no resistance movement outside of Denmark that can really point to the fact that it saved 90% of its population from deportation.
by just straight up saying, no, this isn't going to happen either. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. It really is. One thing we skipped over, and I want to go back to, what about the Oprop leaflets that were dropped?
That's the leaflets that were in Norwegian, right?
Norwegian and a little bit of Danish.
They didn't even
Danish,
take the time to translate it into the correct language of the country they were invading.
It's real sad, isn't it?
Right?
You know?
Like, y'all could
Shows
have
you how
taken
much
the
they
time.
thought it was how long it was going to take to get through there.
Exactly.
That's really telling at that point in the film too, when there's this kind of demoralization is really taking hold there, and they see these leaflets, and of course it's just a reminder about German air power. You know, these things are being dropped from the air, and what can they do? I mean, there's nothing they can do to challenge the Luftwaffe. And what they don't know is interesting. What they don't know, of course, they have no communication with Copenhagen, with the capital, but the Germans have landed, troops there. There is some fighting with the Danish Royal Guard, not much but a little, but they can probably guess that already things elsewhere are falling apart. But the fact that these leaflets calling on the population to not resist, to embrace the Germans, is just another factor, I think, that makes them realize that this is not going to last very long.
Yeah, we're here to protect you from British and French invasion is essentially what it said. We're here to make sure you guys are okay, which for 3 years they kind of did. So surrender is obviously what happens to not only our heroes in the film, but the nation as a whole. What does this film suggest about the decision to surrender, either by the nation or the soldiers, or both? What's your opinion on that, Chrissy? What do you think?
Yeah, as I said, I'm kind of thinking about the political leadership's goal is to avoid the Nazi government taking hold of Denmark. Then if they can negotiate to maintain their own government democratic government, that they're going to do it. So you even see that at the beginning of the movie where, as the Germans are inching closer to the border and the top commander gets on the phone, and he's communicating back with the capital of, when to engage. And they're like, no, just hang out until, and they're all kind of shocked that is what gets passed down. But the leadership is waiting for that moment that they feel like they can negotiate with Germany to get the best hand, I would assume, at least.
What do you think, Amber?
Something that really just kind of brought home the realization of surrender for me was at the very end, where the second lieutenant and the young soldier that was able to speak German, whose father was from Germany, and they were speaking to whatever commanding officer from the German military that was there. And he's like, well, you didn't know that y'all had surrendered? And the look on his face of we literally just lost people over nothing when we surrendered a couple of hours ago. And it's just this heartbreaking moment of, I got my people killed. I got my men killed. And if I would have just taken a moment and had a little hubris and maybe thought about stepping away and maybe not having such a moment of wanting to go out and fight and go out and really defend, and really thought about, well, what is the country doing right now? Or thinking about the well-being of these men, maybe I wouldn't have lost some of my guys.
I think that was heartbreaking, like you said, because he realized after the German officer, the lieutenant, told him that, you guys surrendered 2 hours ago. Why are you still fighting? And you could see it all over his face. Eustason was the guy that was killed there. Mm-hmm. And you could see it all over his face, oh man, but it wasn't his fault either. There was no communication. He had no communication.
Well,
as a soldier, his job is to fight. That's what he's there to do. And he did his job. And nobody told the dude that they were quitting,
But there is a moment, though, where he's debating whether to surrender when they're like, hey, we don't have any medical supplies. We don't have any medical supplies. What do we do? What do we do? And they're yelling at him. And he sits there for a long time. And also the Pilu Asbeck, he does a very, like, his face is so expressive, and you can see that he's
anguished.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, there's nothing left, right? And he delays that decision to surrender, and I think in that time, then you see his, someone in his platoon die. But if he would have surrendered potentially, even a minute before, like, he may have lived. I don't know. You know what I mean? So there's even those small moments where that could have made a difference.
Yeah, he was going through like
Personally.
the shoulda, woulda, couldas, right?
Yeah.
Like, hindsight
really
is
felt
always
that.
20/20, right? And you're just like, wow, if I would have maybe just taken a moment, taken a breath, stepped back, and maybe rethought my decision, then somebody's son would still be here. But now his blood is on my hands. And then also thinking about the young man that was with him and translating for him. Now the both of them have to share that burden together until the rest of them realize, hey, we were fighting for those last couple hours for no reason, and our comrade fell when he could have still been here with us.
Well, the second lieutenant had been there's those debates earlier in the movie about should we tell them, which we let them know about how close the Germans are and the like, and no, let's hold a lot of this information, and so that's a big theme, I think, of the film is communication, of the lack of it, and
which is accurate,
right? Secrets and what you tell your men and what you don't, and it is, I think, especially heartbreaking. He's holding the dog tags of those two men he lost, and the second, of course, had just told him he wanted to be a grocer. He didn't want any part of the military way of life. He was going to do his part. He was going to, carry out his duty, but he wanted to be a grocer. He wanted the simple life. He wanted to get married, and he wanted to have a big family. And he's the second one that gets killed.
And he fell in his hometown, right? That Hotterslav, again, my Dutch, or like my Danish, excuse me, Danish Dutch is terrible. But yeah, he's like fell in his hometown, which is so, it's just such a sad, realization at the end,
I mean, as soon as he gave his, what he wants to do in the future, I was like, he's going to die. From me watching the movie, it's like the guy in the red shirt in Star Trek.
Right?
And I was like, oh, he's going to get zapped. That's it. He's going to write him off now. But it was still heartbreaking to see that. So, Amber, I'll start with you. Did you like April 9th, and would you recommend it?
Yes, I liked April 9th. I think it's a great film for American audiences, especially to see because it tells the story of World War II from a completely different perspective than what we usually get from both American movies and movies movies that are done by individuals from countries that participated in the war in a different way. Because as we all have been saying, the Denmark story is something that isn't really shared much, at least not for us, where, we talk about the European front in the American context, we talk about the Pacific, but we don't really talk about some of these smaller countries who were very much affected. I would definitely recommend anybody who's really interested in subtitles and can read fast to definitely enjoy this movie because it's a tough one to watch, but it adds a real depth to World War II history that we don't normally get.
Jay, what about you?
I liked it. In fact, I liked it quite a bit. I thought the cinematography, we should know, was great. I thought the score was great. Very strong acting. There was a real attention, as a couple of you have already noted, Chrissy especially, about historical detail. And I think it shows a side of the war that we don't often get to see, which is the very early stages of the war. As Seth, you pointed out, this is April 1940. This is early on, and the Germans look invincible, and they're going to look even more invincible in another month or so when they roll over into France, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. And you're kind of seeing that here, and how these guys, it's a small group of guys, but what they did and what they went through in those several hours on April 9th. So I would definitely recommend for people to see it.
Chrissy?
I think I'm Amber's echo today, but I think I would recommend it for the same reasons, because it's a news story. Literally going into this, my only thought about Denmark and World War II was Lois Lowry's 1989 book that I read as a child, Number the Stars, which I think every kid in American schools probably reads at some point between 3rd grade and 6th grade. And so that's a story that maybe people are familiar with, and this kind of provides the proper historical background to get to that point in that relatively familiar World War II fictional book, but still based on, historical reality.
Yeah, I agree with everybody at the table. I like this movie. I admittedly went into it going, it's talking about 6 hours of war. How good can this be? And I forget what the exact runtime of the movie was. It was like 88 minutes or 98 minutes or something like that. It wasn't very long, much like the combat in Denmark. But it was really, really good. I really liked it. I was pleasantly surprised. And, I mean, it was shot beautifully. It looked great. The scenes in the barracks I thought looked really, really cool. It was very evident that they were using, that was not a set, that was a real place. It looked really good. The combat scenes looked very good. The uniforms looked good. Like I said, there were a couple of flubs here and there, but whatever. I'll give it a pass. But like you said, Jason, there aren't many movies about this early stage in the war from any aspect, be it the Danish, the Belgian, the French, even the German. There's not a whole heck of a lot to choose from, and this was a very, very good movie. I thought I would highly recommend this movie because it is something that you don't hear about very often, and it was done very, very well. So, Amber, final thoughts?
Surrender doesn't mean failure. That's what I took from this film.
Good point. Jason?
I think I agree with Amber's comment. Obviously, when you know something about the later history of Denmark and the war, I really was impressed with how candid it is. I mean, you see all the tensions in the country kind of politically and militarily playing out there, and they show that. They show Denmark did not last very long. I don't think it's mythologized. It's shown quite accurately that, and yet they were men who fought, and they try to show their stories. Especially, we shouldn't forget the. It made me think of here working at the National World War II Museum when you get those clips at the end of guys who did see combat in that one day, and they kind of share a bit of their story.
Chrissy?
I think, honestly, the best war films, and sometimes we get away with this with special effects and, all the cool equipment, is that they're innately, human stories. And sometimes these very small, human stories about these individuals. There's only, maybe 5 main guys at the end. But that humanity of this movie, and as I said, set it apart for me and was a pleasant surprise as well. So I think that's kind of the vein that carries through the entire movie for me, is that it felt so relatable because it is such a human story, no matter what language it's in or what it's about.
I agree completely. I'm not going to pull a quote from this movie because I don't speak the Danish language, but I will echo what everybody here said, and that it is a human story. It's done very well. The acting is superb. The story itself is really good. It's beautiful. Beautifully shot. It's a fantastic movie. Highly recommended. Didn't think I'd like it, and it turned out that I loved it. So definitely check it out. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, tune into our mini episode next week. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.